Our next paper is from Jenny Fawbert, who's come down to us from New South Wales. And it's on a particular interest of hers, the work of J.P. Innes and his... Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks very much, Harriet. Thank you, everybody. This is going to be an overdrive through the life of George Innes. It comes a very small condensation of over 20,000 words so far and growing on George Innes. It's all started because the curator at the Motorlife Museum, where there's an Innes car, said, "I wonder how many there were." She said that 2 years ago, and it's now become my life. George. And I now call him George because, again, he's become my life and I've become very familiar with him, I think. When George Innes started in the motorcycle business in Sydney in 1897, bicycles were all the rage. It seemed a logical business for someone of a mechanical bent like George. But he'd always been fascinated by engines, and as like several other motoring pioneers of that day, he used the bicycle firm as his entry into the automotive industry. He ventured into importing, assembling and selling motor cars when there were no business models for such enterprises, and very few others engaged in those enterprises. He was born at Hobart in 1863. His father was a well-known surveyor down there, but George, as I said, had always been mechanically minded. He described his early years thus: "I commenced trying to make engines and nearly blew my head off when my homemade boiler burst. However, I kept on trying, and at the age of 9, I had a crude sort of engine going, all of my own make." That was George. From school, he tried several other trades, but settled on being an engineer and came to Sydney to work with a railway contractor in the early 1890s. He married Susanna Mills in Sydney and resided here for the rest of his life, where they raised their 3 children. Innes's brother-in-law was one Robert Augustus Mills, who at that time was a highly successful bicycle competitor, and in partnership the brothers-in-law opened their cycle works in 1897 in Bathurst Street, Sydney, advertising that amongst being bicycle salesmen, they were practical mechanical engineers. They quickly got involved in bicycling aspects, well, in all aspects of bicycling, sorry. They sponsored events. They were well known in cycling circles throughout New South Wales and interstate. But George, as I said, was most interested in engines, and the press at the time was full of all the stories about when were we going to get motorcycles, motor cars, or something with a motor in it in Australia. In 1898, a company called the English and American Cycle Agency landed 7 of the Gladiator motor tricycles. These had DD-on engines. Along with the Gladiators came a very prominent lady cyclist, Mademoiselle Serpolette. She gave exhibition rides in most of the capital cities around Australia, and there's no doubt that George Innes there saw a Gladiator motorcycle demonstrated in Sydney. At the time, Innes and Mills were agents for Rudge Whitworth Cycles, and they employed staff assembling and building new bicycles and some of George's own inventions. He built Tasma spray pumps for the agricultural industry and a very successful collapsible child's cart. I have no idea what that is, but apparently it sold well. There are photographs, I promise you, but because he's such an obscure person, photographs are hard to come by, but there will be some. The opportunity for George to become involved personally with motor vehicles came about when he purchased one of Serpolette's Gladiator tricycles, and off George tootled quite a lot apparently on that tricycle. At the time, there were fewer than half a dozen what were called motor cars in Sydney. They were all motor bicycles or tricycles actually. Motor cars were unknown in any part of New South Wales. The first automobile Innes most likely saw was the Thomson steam car, which we saw some great photographs of earlier, exhibited at the 1900 Sydney show. The partners at that time were advertising as cycle and motor engineers, and they'd even opened country branches. By the 1901 Sydney show, they sold DD-on engine tricycles they imported from Britain. But motor cars were still obviously engaging George because he had the bright idea and patented for a motor and steering attachment to fit to ordinary horse-drawn vehicles. Have you ever seen any of those patents? They're bizarre. And as someone who's restored horse-drawn vehicles and drives them, I don't see how they were going to work. But anyway, George had patented one of those. By now, there's still less than 20 motor cars in Sydney. And by that, it's that broad classification at the time. That's motorcycles, motor tricycles, and 2 or 3 or 4 possibly motor cars running around Sydney. One more was added in July when George landed a 5 horsepower Piper motor car. He recalled about the Piper, "When I unpacked it, got the engine going, the trouble was to drive it." Remember, he's only running a tricycle at this stage, motor-wise, but after some practice, I ventured out with the family on board, managed to negotiate the city streets without much difficulty. In August, so confident was George, and having been invited by the Show Society, he shipped the car to Newcastle, drove at 60 miles to Singleton Show, and proceeded to give rides. George is not giving rides because he likes to give rides in his car. He's hoping to sell more like it. But he struck trouble. Everyone wanted a ride. The axle broke and he had to make a new one before driving it back home again. George's mechanical abilities come to the fore. That's the Piper. As you can see, it's a rugged-looking machine. You'd want to venture anywhere in that, I'm sure. But George thought it was good enough to put his little girls in. That's 2 of his daughters, Elspeth and Myrtle, in the Piper. By late 1901, Innes was not only one of the most experienced motorists, and that's a small category, I guess, but he was the first New South Wales motorist fined for speeding. He was very proud of that right through to the end of his life. In August, a constable observed him driving in the Domain, the big park in Sydney, at about 18 miles an hour. Upon being stopped, George indicated the vehicle was under repair, and he didn't know he was driving that fast. The magistrate still fined him 10 shillings. Motorcycling was still in its infancy in Australia, but George, undaunted, ventured up country in one of his tricycles, presumably to encourage sales and to contract local bicycle shops as agencies. Wherever he rode, particularly in northern New South Wales and the New England area, it's reported in a lot of the papers, he caused quite a stir in the streets. The first motor car scene. Motorised pacing machines were supplied by the Innes and Mills Company, presumably some they were building because they advertised them as a Victoria motorcycle, and they still were very involved in the cycling fraternity. That fraternity did not allow motorcycle races, but in 1902 they allowed a test run from one of their major events. One Pete Thompson rode a motor bicycle built by Innes and Mills against one built by Isaac Fazakerly, another well-known name in the Sydney early motor trade, and another one by Mr Drury. The success prompted a motorcycle race to be run in Sydney. It was easily won by Robert Augustus Mills on the Innes and Mills built motor bicycle. But George is moving on. He's after cars. He's starting to deal in cars. He's taking cars as trade and he's moving the cars around a little bit, and he's importing more cars. Not many, but he is starting to import cars. The fact that he's starting to drive other cars at events, particularly the first major event organised by motorists in Sydney in late 1902, shows George is wheeling and dealing. He's driving a Winton, and one of the other early drivers, George Bradwin, is driving the Piper. George has already moved it on. The cars he imports, unfortunately, apart from the Piper, the make is unidentified in any of the import lists, so we're still trying to figure that one out. George is confident about his cars. He revisits the family in Tasmania in February 1983, takes one of the cars. Really hard to tell what car it is in this photograph, but he has great hopes when he takes it down to a big fete in Newlands. He gives people rides in the car and it's advertised for sale at £400. There's no record that George actually managed to sell the car there though. It's suspicion as he left it with family in Tasmania. By 1903, Innocent Mills was one of the established motor traders in Sydney. That's pretty good, one of the top 3 or 4, of which there only are 3 or 4, but he's there. They advertise new shipments of 5 and 6 horsepower cars of the best French make. The make is not specified. They are selling Thomas Auto Buy, a little motorised bicycle from America, and they manufacture new 2.5 horsepower motorcycles on their own premises. They're rightly cautious about not naming the make of cars they're importing. Sydney firm Bennett & Wood are advertised widely by that stage. They've been appointed DDON's exclusive agents for New South Wales and Victoria, and they guard the right jealously. An example of one of George's unnamed cars is this one. George sold this in January 1904 to prominent stall businessman W.B. Wilkinson. Wilkinson had driven to Sydney in a covert car. It must have not been quite, it got there, but it must have been great because he quickly turned it over and got this one from George and proceeded to drive it back to stall with no trouble. The firm's shift to motor cars continued by them having a car and driver available for hire and motor car parts for sales. But Robert Mills by that stage is still dedicated to bicycles, and the business partnership ends at the end of 1904. In 1905, George starts off fresh, offering a variety of cars from 120 to 300 pound, and his hitherto unidentified cars began to be advertised and noted in the press as Innes cars. Perhaps stick it around the Bennett and Wood DD-on problem. He has some prominent, good photograph there. That's one of those cars advertised as an Innes, clearly in the motoring press at the time. He also picks up some more prominent customers, the two Arnott brothers from Arnott's Biscuits, J.M. and H.R. Arnott. The Arnott brothers purchase an Astor engine 4-cylinder 5-passenger Innes, that's what it's called, and a 9-horsepower DD-on engine 2-seater Innes. And they enter their cars in the February 1905 5-day Dunlop motor reliability trial from Sydney to Melbourne. That's the bigger Innes car, and that's the littler one. This is possibly believed to be the car that could be at Motorlife Museum. J.M. Arnott took his chauffeur, obviously, and a very good friend, one A.B. Patterson. Banjo Patterson, then the editor of the evening newspaper, who sent reports back daily to the papers. The trial inspired from Patterson the poem The Lay of the Motor Car. If you've not read it, it's online quite easily, I suggest you do. Please remember, it's written from the seat of an Innes car. Patterson's 4 special reports were titled Overland to Melbourne on an Automobile, The History of the Haste Wagons. These were illustrated in the papers by Lionel Lindsley, and again, if you haven't read them, I suggest you do. That photograph is thought to be Colonel Arnott and his bigger Innes car. Certainly it's in Gundagai in 1905. It's taken by local photographer, Dr. Charles Gabriel. Having now sort of spent this time with George Innes, I'm positive that that is George Innes handing Colonel Arnott a tin of oil or petrol. When I asked a few people in the Veteran Car Club, could that possibly be George Innes? By what their sort of oral tradition is, yes. George was with the other Arnott's brother in the smaller Innes car on the reliability trial. If that's the case, then that's the smaller Innes car travelling somewhere through country New South Wales, I think. If you really play with that photograph, you can see that the passenger is actually sitting on the floor of the car with his legs dangling over the side, his arm resting on the dashboard. In that case, that's George Innes in the 1905 reliability trial. I'm rather proud of George for doing that, actually, not having two cars there and being in it as well. The big Innes car went well until the Albury section of the trial. Patterson wrote, during the afternoon we had 70 miles to do in under 2 hours. The car was sent headlong into dust and holes without caution. The competition obviously ended quickly then for J.M. Arnott when, as Patterson recorded, near Tarcutta, bang went some spokes of a wheel. Some flour mill mechanics at Albury bolted stout timber supports onto either side of the wheel, and with many stoppages we got into Melbourne just before the speeches of welcome were quite finished. That's the bigger Innes car in the centre of the photograph limping in, and if you look really closely you can see the repair on the wheel. I'm not sure if this close-up's going to work, but that's it. They bolted planks around the wheel and away they went from Tarcutta down to Melbourne. Says something about the Innes cars, I guess, or the French makers who made them. In November 1905, the senior Arnott wasn't done with trials. He did the reverse run from Melbourne to Sydney. Guess what happened? Near Mullingamdra, the near front wheel of the Innes, the other side, was shattered after hitting a bridge. That's not so great, that's the best photo I've got, but it's really well and truly shattered. Learning from the previous trial, Arnott repaired it by fitting 2 cross pieces of timber on each side of the wheel and continued on. It's a rather amused chauffeur, obviously, sitting there. Arnott's optimism, however, was not rewarded. On the final day, the wheel hit a culvert and collapsed, throwing out the passenger, who suffered a broken ankle, and Arnott and the chauffeur were uninjured. Innes was also optimistic about the possibility of this car coming into the finish in Sydney on the Saturday morning because he advertised, "An irresistible force strikes an immovable mass. The big Innes car demolishes a bridge and comes home on 3 legs. Have a glance at her as she glides silently past. She's lost a few marks but has beaten many others, costing a mint of money. Make a few comparisons and decide on one of our cars. They cost little, run well and keep running." Unfortunately, spectators didn't see the big Innes glide into the finish. It was taken into Picton that afternoon on a wagon. The advertisement, though, was somewhat typical of the style of advertising George used. His competitors' advertisements were quite formal. You saw some of the Dalgety ones up there. But George always used a very chatty style. For instance, shrewd businessmen who have ordered our cars are now patiently waiting for their orders to be executed. Please note our cars are all built in Paris and bear the adopted name of Innes, which we find is now recognised as a sufficient guarantee of their value for money. That's not bad marketing. 1906 started well for George. He's taken on the agency for Humber cars, and he began championing the British-made car, a trait he became well known for in the motor trade. It's the earliest Humbers, again with George putting one of his daughters in the car. It's a little Humberette. But Humber agent or not, George continued to import other cars. The 3 new cars landed in April. One had a 12-14 horsepower 4-cylinder Astor engine and was destined for his very good customer, Mr. Leslie W. Pye. Pye was credited as being the first Parramatta citizen to own a motor car. He'd already owned 2 other Innes cars by that stage. In June, George was advertising that there are probably, from what sounds like it, there are more than 20 Innes cars on the road and dozens of satisfied owners. I'm a little sure about how you get 20 cars and dozens of owners, but anyway, that's creative advertising. So we're now looking at possibly 20 Innes cars by George's reckoning in the ads. Possibly encouraged by his adventure with the Arnotts, George entered the Automobile Club's Sydney to Bathurst and Return Reliability Trial in 1907. He's driving an 8 horsepower Innes and wins a gold medal for single cylinder cars, and Les W. Pye and his new 12-14 horsepower Innes wins the gold medal for larger cars. George is justifiably proud about that win and advertises so about the 2 gold medals for the Innes cars. But he also reminds people he sells Humbers as well. For Pye, the motoring success has continued. This is the beginning of a long career for Les Pye in motorsport. Again with his Innes, he wins the ACA petrol consumption test, and he continues on in a very good winning streak with that car. But in 1907, back with George, we find he's landed probably the last of the French-made Innes cars, a 12-14 horsepower model. He's moved to new premises in 1908, and in 1909 takes over yet another agency, this time for Darragh cars. Despite his French cars, he revisits his British theme frequently in his ads. This one exhorts people to buy British Humber cars because that helps the British skills and the British financing for dreadnoughts, and bear in mind this is still 2 or 3 years before the war. In 1909 he begins his most successful agency, that of Vauxhalls. And in October, strange enough, despite holding the almost ideal trinity of quality vehicles, Vauxhall, Humber and Darragh, he announced he's selling, of all things, the McIntyre motor buggy. If you're familiar with motor buggies, he's obviously aiming at the rural trade there, the farmers. Back to Les Pye. Les Pye takes one of George's new Vauxhalls in 1909 and then continues on his winning streak with that car. Having owned it less than 1 week, he wins a very testing Automobile Club Australia competition. His successes continue on through the next 3 years in that car. George tries his hand at that as well. He takes a 20 horsepower Vauxhall out on an ACA reliability trial. He doesn't get a place. That's because he got to Goulburn too early. He drove it far too fast. But that's the style of car that Pye had. George's business is doing well. Here's his premises in Castlereagh Street, but things are not going quite so well on other fronts. He's a prominent importer of vehicles and parts, but he experiences ongoing issues with customs, as did his fellow importer, Isaac Fazackerley. They were issued writs in 1910 over disputed valuations of their imported cars. This causes quite a ruckus in the motor trade. George, Zackley and a couple of others called together a meeting of the motor trade, and from this begins the Motor Traders Association of New South Wales, with George P. Innes as the founding member. Away from the concerns of the motor trade, Innes accompanied Pye and Dr. Collins when they shipped their Vauxhall and Humber cars to Tasmania to compete in the Tasmania Automobile Club's reliability trial in 1911. Unfortunately, in Hobart, this Vauxhall was dropped from the ship and finished up in the Derwent. Is that the Derwent in Hobart? Yeah. And was considerably damaged. Dr. Collins' Humber, however, driven by George Innes, went on to win the Tasmanian trial. Innes continued his involvement in motorsport for the next few years through the MTA and the Automobile Club of Australia, driving different cars. One, a Dion 4-cylinder, in another event, a 14 horsepower Humber, and sometimes in the Vauxhalls. But a new competitor begins to appear, driving one of Innes's Humbers, one Boyd Edkins. What connected Boyd Edkins and Innes, apart from the Humber, was Les Pye. Edkins and Pye had been together at King's School, and the Edkins and Innes connection would become significant over the next few years. George was successful in displaying his vehicles at the motor shows in Sydney in 1911 and 1912, and they were attracted considerable interest and reported widely throughout newspapers right across Australia. In 1912, he shares his stand with Boyd Edkins. The largest stand at the motor show has Innes showing Humber, Vauxhall and De Dion vehicles. Innes's company shares the stand displaying Durkop lorries. 1912 was very successful for George. He finished the year off by advertising Boyd Edkins' record trip to Brisbane in one of the Vauxhalls. This is the beginning of the many records set by Boyd Edkins. With Edkins, Innes formed a new company in 1913. A few weeks later, that company takes over the advertising and the range of vehicles previously sold by George Innes and Company. But George is not able to retire quite so easily. The Customs Department focused on him in April 1915. He's ordered to pay £1,350 for incorrect entries on undervalued bodies on the Humbers. It goes back quite some years. But the magistrate finds that George at no time deliberately attempted to defraud the Commonwealth, which is a relief. After the customs problem, George was probably welcomed some positive press. The 1914 Sunday Times in July described him as emerging from the pages of early motor history in this state, which is a pleasant countenance of G.P. Innes, still busy, still competing, and still a popular idol with the motor fans. In motoring competition, he does really well at petrol consumption trials. His little Humber averaging 57 miles to the gallon. I'm sorry, it's a pretty poor photograph, but that's his really, really successful car. I'm going to have to go really, really quickly. George retires in 1915, but reappears back in the motor trade in 1916, just selling a few odds and ends, cars and so on, parts, various things like that from his service station. And he's not done with automotive matters. In 1927, he begins a new company, Innes Springs, selling laminated springs, and continues on with more inventions, anti-wheel wobble device and so on for cars. In 1936, Innes dies peacefully at his residence in Wollstonecraft. Pye and elder H.J. Vale and other early pioneer motorists were among the mourners. At the outset, this research had a simple aim: to answer the question, how many Innes cars were there? Newspaper accounts clearly account 6, Pye 3, Arnott's 2, Dr. Farrell 1. But in consideration of the number of new cars George advertised between 1903 and 1908 as Innes cars with Didion or Astor engines, then perhaps George's advertised claim of 20 Innes cars is more correct. However, answering how many Innes cars there were focuses only on a part of a life that left us an important automotive legacy. George Peacock Innes was there at the beginning of our Australian automotive history, contributed to that history as an early motor engineer, as a founder in the motor trade, as one of our first motor importers, as a personnel in the first years of motorsport, as an automotive inventor, and as he was regarded by his contemporaries, a popular pioneer motorist.
much, Jenny. That was terrific. Do we have any questions? Yes, Norm.
You talked about the Innes cars basically came from Paris, but do you know who actually made them in Paris? And how much were they all made in Paris, or was some portion of his car, like the body, built in Australia?
That's what we're really trying to work out, and that's what started me into motor body builders now, trying to figure that one out. There is some suggestion that yes, some of the cars were bodied in Sydney by a local bodybuilder, probably by Steambolts. George seemed to have some kind of relationship with the proprietors of Steambolt Motor Body Works. The cars are pretty much, and Darryl could probably tell you more about this than I about the mechanic, but they're pretty much the Dion or Astor engine French-made cars. Is that correct, Darryl? Pretty much the mechanicals are all that?
Pretty much the Boston car.
Yeah. So yeah, the bodies themselves, we're really struggling to figure that one out. And again, such little photographic evidence makes it very, very difficult. But yeah, it's an ongoing work, and hopefully after today and some access I've been given to some more records in Sydney, I can put an answer to that one. Thanks, Norm. One still exists at Motorlife Museum. The Motorlife car. Bits, little bits, and it's sort of the Veteran Car Club, people in the Veteran Car Club knew about it for a number of years. A guy called Jeff, I can't think of Jeff's name. Simmons, yeah, Jeff Simmons. He restored the car, and that was down here at Motor Classica a few years ago. And now it lives at Motorlife. It's one of the cars that Motorlife was able to purchase under the Protection of Movable Cultural Heritage grant. It wasn't prevented from going overseas by the grant. It was purchased before it ever came up for an export permit. It was purchased with some money from that grant, and lives a very happy life at Motorlife. And if you're really lucky, sometimes Darryl comes up and drives it.
I was just going to comment, because it came up after the previous paper about bodies being made locally. The key date, I believe, is 1907. There was a change in the import tariff requirements, and you can see if you actually look at the import tariff figures before that, they count individual motor cars, and after that there was so many chassis and parts coming in that they just start counting packages or whatever. So there was quite a change in the trade, I believe, in all the states. It may not have impacted on some of those more valuable cars, but anything that was at the lower end of the market, they were making bodies locally.
The import tariff on motor vehicles is an extremely complex area, and I have an admission, I actually did my final paper for my graduation of history on that very topic many years ago at Macquarie Uni. It is a very complex area, and you have the complexity of around 1901 when Federation came in. You've still got customs and so on happening in different areas, so major issues around what constitutes a motor car. What's the difference between a motor car and a motorcycle? Should we consider horsepower? Do we have bodies, the fitting, all that sort of stuff? And as you go through, as you said, to that later, that Edwardian period, cars are coming in with windscreens, headlights, mudguards. The customs are like, do we tariff the mudguard? Is it a separate item? And then they're also trying to protect the coach building industry, which is very, very vocal, is very well organised. So yeah, it doesn't really settle probably until the Depression. The whole thing about the tariff and the cars. It's someone looking for a research paper, a PhD. I'm happy to help because it's a big topic.
One more question.
Just a quick comment on the body thing. It also depended on the manufacturer. Some made complete units and some only made rolling chassis. So it depended on what was available as well, what actual market what.
Humber is another one that actually sent their bodies out, like the Daimler. So that's where George came unstuck. He was waiting for invoices to come from England that sometimes didn't arrive at the same time as the bodies, and that's where, when he'd declare something for customs, he'd give his best estimate, and that's what the magistrate took into account.
George was obviously a handy man. Did he actually modify himself, or was they completely at state?
I suspect that most of the cars, by the stage of when in 1903, 1904, George is selling the complete, just assembling and selling the complete car. But certainly before that, he was quite capable of building a car from scratch himself. And his motor garage at home in the 1920s was considered to be a museum of early motoring memorabilia in Sydney. Those cars were completely unmodified for those first two trials. I'm there. By November 1905, after the French driver had sort of basically blitzed the field from Sydney to Melbourne and managed to avoid all the disasters everyone else had, and he'd taken his mudguards off, everyone by this November went, "Oh, I'm taking the mudguards off, it's going faster." That was a modification.
Thanks, Judy. This is great.